One of those characters from history who are far too interesting for their own good in some ways is Billy Mitchell. He just is. He's interesting. But he's interesting more because of what he pursues in many ways than what he does. And certainly more than what he achieves, because the thing is, his pursuit and his firm belief about what the future would be guided his actions, and he was definitely one of those people who believed that the end justifies the means. I know what the ends are going to be, therefore whatever I do is justified by them because I'm achieving the thing which is necessary. Now please note, he's a thorough patriot. He is. He's a bit of an egotist. He is certainly not shy from self-promotion and self-enlargement, but he's no MacArthur. It's not himself before everything else. No, he does think about the country. It's just, he has a very, very, very confident view on the future. And that's always the scariest thing. Whenever you're dealing with someone like this, who knows what the future's going to be, who knows what the outcome is going to be, that's scary to deal with. Because a person who's absolutely sure of what the end is going to be can justify doing a lot of things in order to getting there. Because they know they're right. So they don't care about how you work out the sums to get to that answer. They know that's the right answer. And I worry about those people. I worry about them when it's technology, I worry about them when it's politics, I worry about them in any circumstance, because the fact about humanity is, it's a very, very complicated system. There are lots of wheels within wheels, of motion within motion. And there's a lot of parts of it which aren't logical and don't follow something which you can necessarily predict. Or rather, necessarily map out with certainty. And I do love, I deal with a lot of people today who try and give me mathematical certainties of predicting what the future is going to be like, and I look at them and go, but you're basing this on what we know now. 10 years ago, we knew about a quarter of what we know now. So the fact is, you're basing it on imperfect data. Always on imperfect data. And the first rule of computing is garbage in, garbage out. And it's the same with mathematical sums, it's the same with any analysis. You know, when people start going, well, you know, based on the history, this is what humans are going to do, I laugh. I think I can definitely qualify as a professional historian, as I make my living from it, and I have a PhD, so I'm a professional academic historian. Okay? I think I fulfill those criteria. And I laugh when people say we know history. We know facts, we know figures. We can make assumptions and we can build up evidence and arguments, and most modern history books are that. They are arguments based on these are the facts, and if we put them together, this is what it seems to outline, this would be the logical argument. But we don't know what people are thinking. On this channel, I talk a lot about a guy called Admiral Henderson, who was the third Sea Lord of the Royal Navy from about 1933 till when he died in 1939, and he built the Royal Navy. And I can tell you now that from what I've seen of what he wrote down in the Admiralty archives, from what I've read about him by others, and from what I've seen of what he actually did and how it turned out, you get a far more complicated picture of a person if you just follow one of those pieces of evidence. And even then, I will not claim to always know what he's thinking. I have an idea what he's thinking. But I'm certain he doesn't say everything he's thinking. I'm certain he doesn't write down everything he says. And even more than that, I'm certain that some of the choices which he makes, the reason he gives for those choices are not the reason he makes those choices. Why am I certain of that? Because, as a rule, in order to justify the construction he wants to go, he will talk to the crowd he's with, and will give them the reasons which will best fit their line of thinking. And the moment you have someone like that in that crowd, talking to a group, you have a problem. Because you're not sure if they're revealing what they're thinking, or if they're revealing what they think those listening, will want to hear. And when you're dealing with characters like that, well, then you go through history and you realize pretty much all humans are like that. Humans tend to be fairly quick and fairly clever. And they tend to, most humans who are in leadership positions, tend to work out very quickly that certain crowds are going to respond more to certain information put in a certain perspective than that information put in another way, and another perspective. You prioritize your answer depending on who you're talking to, not depending on what you believe necessarily. Why am I saying all this? Why am I starting off with this as a discussion of Billy Mitchell, and as a complicated character? Because let's consider Billy. Let's consider him. His dad is a senator. By definition, a politician. His father had also served in the American Civil War as a first lieutenant in the same regiment along with General Arthur MacArthur, who is General Douglas MacArthur's dad. Now, he was a senator from 1883 to 1889, so I think that means he's a one-term senator. But still, he's a senator. His paternal grandfather was not only a Scotsman who'd emigrated to America, but was the man who established the Milwaukee Railroad and the Marine Bank of Wisconsin. He had a park and a shopping precinct named in his honor. His grandmother ran the local charities, art and society circles. All these are a lot of people who are very good at talking to the right crowd. So that's his background. And then we have Mitchell. Mitchell is a believer. He is a fervent believer in aviation. And I think, possibly to an extent, the reason he talks in such strong superlatives and gives such definite assurances is because he knows he's talking to crowds who are looking for certainty in a changing world. But you combine those tendencies, those skills, the ability to deliver what is needed for the crowd listening, combined with a fervent belief in what the future is going to be, and you have someone who is prepared quite happily to disregard quite a lot of rules and regulations to get what he wants done. And that's actually what ends up pulling him and making him come a cropper. That is what ends up pulling the rug from under him. But that's not till long after this. This is the 1921. And 1921 we're going to be talking about. I'll be giving a bit of an overview of his career prior to then, and I'll talk about the testing and the purpose of the test, and then I'll talk about what would be the impact. Because one of the things is this is the earliest point at which they're really starting to try and do graduated testing with combined services involvement. And the thing is, you can also argue that this has an impact not just on the Navy, but also on the US Army Air Corps, because one of the things that comes from this and carries on is the US Army Air Corps commitment to bombing, and level bombing, that is, of surface ships. There's also some interesting things in that some things are excluded because they're known what will happen. One of the interesting points that comes up sometimes people talk about when there's testing is one of the rules excluded using torpedo bombers. Everyone goes, oh, well, you know, that's showing they're slanting at the Navy's protection. No, it's because the Navy didn't need to test if torpedo bombers would work. The Royal Navy had already shown it, so had the Japanese and other powers in World War I. They had already shown that it was quite capable of an aircraft dropping a torpedo to sink a ship. So, again, when you go from that, you sort of, people say, well, this finally shows that aircraft can sink ships. No, it doesn't. Fudging up the exercise the way he does not show it can finally the aircraft can sink ships. It had already been shown. It had already happened in World War I. There is a reason navies are already building aircraft carriers, having air services, long before this. It's not because any of them don't think, you know what, aircraft can't do anything useful. No, they are sure of that. There is a debate, and as I discussed within both the British Naval Aviation Doctrine Development in the 1920s and 30s and the US Naval Aviation Doctrine Development in the 1920s and 30s, and I'll link both videos up in cards, one after the other, here. Well, there's a development of time. As the weapon systems and aircraft get more reliable, they turn from less and less from being, in many ways, the targeting systems of capital ships, to being their own systems of themselves. But at a certain point in the 1920s, in practicality terms, aircraft are more useful as targeting systems at this point, barring torpedo attacks. It's fun. So, shameless book plug. Now, I always like to say thank you for anyone watching these videos, and if you like the video, please do consider liking, sharing, subscribing. It really does help the channel grow, and I really do like the channel to grow because I want to spread the love of naval history. It might not be a communicable disease, but I'm doing my best to make it so. Or rather, to communicate it to as many people as possible. But also I do a shameless book plug. Always do a shameless book plug. Why do I plug my book? Why will I be plugging my books when I have more out? Well, I'm an academic naval historian. As said, I am a academic professional historian. Academics at universities only get permanent jobs in the UK or get promoted if their books are doing well enough, if they have sold enough of them, if they have published enough of them. And, well, no one else is going to advertise them, so I will, in every single one of my videos. Also, I want to just clarify something, because this actually did come up as a point of discussion when I was doing research. Which Billy Mitchell am I talking about? I'm not talking about either the pro gamer, who with all the fun history he's had, or the EastEnders character with all the... Well, EastEnders is a soap opera. I'm just going to leave it at that, okay? The history of Billy Mitchell is probably one of the most tortured souls ever put on television. And basically, I think that facial expression is him at his happiest in the show. I'm not sure. I haven't watched it for about... I've managed to avoid EastEnders and other soaps for... best part of 23 years. I'm not going back to them. So, Billy Mitchell. We're talking about this one. We're talking about the US Army officer. We're talking about the air power proponent who predicted apparently as early as 1906 that future conflicts would take place in the air, not on the ground. This is whilst an instructor at the Army Signal Corps, and the Army Signal Corps had taken control of their air power. That's where they were having it. He's also very good at promotion. He's very good at becoming a prominent personality because he knows that's what's needed. He's very good at projecting himself as a hero. And To be honest, I'd argue he is a pretty good hero. I'd also argue he gets a very good write-up thanks to his sister Ruth, who had the fun of being a reporter alongside the Serbian Chetniks in Yugoslavia during World War II, and after World War II wrote the book about her brother, my brother Bill. It's an interesting read, but you can also tell it's written by a sister. You know, if a book was written by my sister about me, I'm fairly sure it'd be just as positive. Because siblings, as a rule, critique in private, praise in public. Now, why are we talking about this officer? Why are we talking about him? Well, despite him starting off with being accepted and doing some time at Columbia University, which later became George Washington University in Washington, D.C., he dropped out to join the U.S. Army in the Spanish-American War. He did eventually graduate from the school, but, you know, he focused on his army service. Now, initially he starts off in the infantry. And very quickly, Mitchell is assigned and mobilized into Brigadier General Arthur MacArthur's command. Remember the man who'd served with his father? And when MacArthur is placed in charge of the Department of Northern Luzon in the spring of 1899, Mitchell participates in the war against the Philippine insurgents. And there, mostly under still MacArthur's command, he quickly gets promoted not just from the infantryman he signed to an officer. He gets commissioned into the US Army Signal Corps, which will hopefully be a safer posting. And that is shamelessly done by his father's influence, calling up, probably not just on his senatorial contacts, but also directly probably calling his old buddy, Brigadier General Arthur MacArthur, and going, you've got my son in your infantry line. Now, I can't critique a father for doing that, frankly. You know, people will sit there and go, but that's misusing his influence and all these things. And I agree it's misusing his influence, but I also, you can't not understand a father going, my son's fighting in a very dangerous, very violent insurgency. I'd like him to be in the safest position as possible. I have the influence to do it. It's very human. But one thing that is interesting about Mitchell is that despite having all this influence to back him up and a potential civilian career, he stays in the army. You know, he's got wealth behind him. He's got power behind him. He could have gone for president. He could have gone for many different things. He doesn't. In fact, from 1900 to 1904, he's posted to the District of Alaska as a lieutenant in the Signal Corps, and he is literally there to establish a communication system. He is establishing a telegraph line. The Alaska Military Cable and Telegraph System. To be precise, the Washington Alaska Military Cable and Telegraph System, which, by the way, is still, I think, the foundation for quite a lot of communications in Alaska to this day. After all, it was transferred to the Air Force in 1962 from the Army, and purchased by RCA Corporation, the Radio Corporation of America, for $31.5 million in 1970. It was a massive operation, but he was in charge. And then after that, he gets an instructor's post at the Army Signal School in Fort Leavenworth, and that's where he makes his 1906 prediction. He then gets selected to be on the serve on the General Staff. He was his youngest member when he was selected at the age of 32 in 1912. And at this point, he's called in 1913 to be a representative of the Army General Staff at legislative hearings in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, on the various points considering a bill which would have made Army aviation a separate branch from the Signal Corps. Later on, He's in May 1916. He's made a temporary head of the aviation section of the U.S. Army, U.S. Signal Corps, because its previous head had been relieved of duty for malfeasance. And when Lieutenant Colonel George Esquire arrived, he became his personal assistant. He actually took personal flying lessons at the Curtis Flying School in June 1916 because the Army wasn't going to pay for him to fly. Spending, $1,500 in that period, which is a lot of money. A lot of money to do so. Again, shows how much money he has behind him. In July 1916, he was promoted to major and appointed Chief of Air Service of the 1st Army. So he's basically in charge of their air power. And it's in this role he finds himself travelling through Spain en route to France as an observer during 1917, when the USA declares war on Germany. And it's, He therefore arrives in Paris on the 10th of April, 1917, 4 days after the declared war, and sets up an office for the aviation section, and from that point starts talking to people such as Hugh Trenchard and the other great aviationists of their era. On the 24th of April, he made the first flight as an American officer over German lines, flying with a French pilot. Now, let's think about that. He's pretty much the only American aviation officer in France in April 1917. He's setting up all the provisions for the air service, or for their aviation section to come there. And on 24th of April, he goes for a flight across German lines. I'm sure it never entered his head, but if he'd been shot down, that would have been a nightmare to deal with. I'm sorry, but this is not really the height of military professionalism. This is showboating. Yes, you can say he's getting experience. And I would agree, as a senior officer who's going to be in charge, he does need experience. But you wait till others are there. You use the experience of others, of your allies, until you have enough personnel there that if you die, the whole system doesn't fall apart. That everything doesn't just go, until your replacement arrives. Because that's the reality in April 1917. Because think about that, when you're initially setting up everything to arrive and set up these things, that's when very important decisions have to be made. And you're the senior officer on site. He's a major. He's chief of the air service of the 1st Army. He's been deployed there to watch and is now running and setting up their aviation section in France for their expeditionary forces which are en route or being about to be sent. No wonder the MacArthurs liked him. He's straight out of their mould. And he quickly earns not only experience to set up the American air operations, but he becomes a reputation as being a daring, flamboyant, and tireless leader. He's elevated first to the temporary rank of colonel in October 1917, with the rank being backdated to August. And in September 1918, he actually apparently leads attack and plans and leads 1,500 British, French, and Italian aircraft in the air phase of the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Now, there's one of the interesting things here. When you look up the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, there are a lot of Americans involved. There are. The Americans provide 216,000 troops, and 48,000 troops and are provided by the French. And it is very much an Allied victory. But one of the interesting things when you look through this battle under General Pershing and you look at the discussions with everyone else involved is that I would say Mitchell's role of being in charge of things, if he can even claim he has the role, it's often described as he was coordinating. Now, in military terms, you're usually described as being put in charge of. You're responsible, you're in charge. Coordinating, working between allies, yes, and they do mostly agree, but there's quite a lot of more senior officers from the other air services who are far more experienced who are involved. So I would say some of that is definitely burnishing and probably how he remembered it, rather than necessarily him actually being in charge. And the fact is, he's not made a temporary brigadier general till October 1914. Which point, he commands all the air combat units in France and is chief of the air service and chief of the group of the armies. Now, one of the things he does certainly do while he's in France is manage to annoy Pershing and pretty much every general, every other American senior officer in France. He manages to do it brilliantly. I mean, he pisses them off so much that, frankly, Pershing, when he's head of the army, would have promoted anyone other than Mitchell. And mostly that comes down to the fact they view him not necessarily dislike him for his air power truth or for his statements. They don't mind him for supporting air power. What they don't like him doing is a continually, how do I put this? What matters to Mitchell in a lot of his discussions and portrayals and articles and things he pushes out there and statements he pushes out there is not the truth, but his version of the truth. And in World War I, in his deployment in Europe, it's already starting to get to his perspective on the truth than the truth. It's not quite got to his version of the truth, but it's certainly got to a very Mitchell-slanted perspective on the truth. It's not lying or outright changing the facts, but it's already getting problematic for an organisation like the Army to deal with. One of the interesting things about armed forces is they depend upon people speaking truth to power, which means they have to actually be speaking the truth. And it depends a lot upon people being able to trust the information they're being shared. The moment you start to get a reputation for slanting the truth, for presenting your analysis as factual evidence, rather than presenting the evidence and then giving your analysis, you have a problem. Now, at points you're asked for your analysis and then you give your analysis. That's fine. You've been asked for it. But you always have to be careful to distinct what is evidence and what is analysis. Because everyone does their own analysis. Everyone puts their own perspective on the truth. The why they think that matters. How they rank the importance of a piece of information, a piece of evidence. That's all perspective. And that's fine. But you also have to be careful about what is evidence and what is analysis. What is fact, what is argument. These things matter. And therefore it's really post-World War I, where you've no longer gotten the necessity of war to justify someone with such driving ambition and purpose being in charge, that things really start to become problematic. Because the first thing that happens is that Well, Mitchell returns to the USA and thinks he's going to be made the director of the Air Service. He presumes that he's going to be put in charge of it. Instead, Charles D. Menoa, a artilleryman, commanded the Rainbow Division in France, a very capable, very good officer, is appointed in charge of it by General John Pershing. There are two arguments for this. One, already it's viewed that air power is important to the operation of ground forces, and therefore they want to make sure that air power retains within the ground forces, that they can still have it as part of the army. Because Mitchell has already started talking about the fact that the air is one, and air power is the future of war, and it should be separated off into its own separate service. And let's be honest, by January 1919, Pershing has already spotted that happen in Britain. Remember, that's April Fool's Day 1918. April the 1st, 1918. And is already starting to see some of the issues. So instead, Mitchell receives the appointment as Director of Military Aeronautics. Basically, he's heading up the flying component of the air service and is, in many ways, charged with inventing the future of aviation, which you could argue was very good. But the trouble is, that office was an in-name-only appointment, as it was a wartime agency, which would expire 6 months after the signing of a peace treaty. So we consider the peace treaty, November 1918, November, December, January, February, March, April. So he's appointed in February. Now, this is made worse because Menoa, that very nice artilleryman who's in charge of the air service, then reorganizes the air service into a basing it on the divisional system of the American Expeditionary Force, and actually eliminates the Director of Military Aeronautics and Department as an organization. At which point Mitchell is made the third assistant executive in charge of the training and operations group as part of the Officer of Director of Air Services in April 1919. He was allowed to retain his rank of Brigadier General until 1920, when he's reduced to Lieutenant Colonel of the Signal Corps. Menoa drops down from a Major General to a Brigadier General on the same orders, because it's the US Army and the US government reducing their senior officers, as they always like to do, as part of the reorganization by Congress. And the air service is actually recognized at this point as a combat arm of the line, third in size behind infantry and artillery in the army. So now it's been a bit of a downward spiral. He's gone from being a director of his own, from being in charge of the air service, to being a director of a department within the air service, to being third in post, and then well, things start to go up. Okay, Menoa's worked his magic, and Menoa has the one who's organised this. Mitchell gets promoted to a Colonel of the Signal Corps, still not Air Service, Colonel of Signal Corps, and gets a recess appointment to become the Assistant Chief of the Air Service with the rank of Brigadier General. Menoa also gets a recess appointment and also gets boosted up. So, July 1920, with all this, he's transferred as permanent rank of Colonel of the Air Service, with him still having that recess appointment as a Brigadier General, and his rank of Colonel makes him first in seniority amongst all Air Service branch officers. All good. At this point, you have an issue, because technically, as the most senior colonel and the most senior officer after Menoa in the air service, he now is presuming that he's going to succeed Menoa. And maybe he could have got over the fact that he hadn't taken over. Maybe he could just think, well, honestly, the fact is I was a relatively junior officer. If his ego would let him go aside up, but actually, no, he prefers to just try and ignore Menoa completely. Which is a problem. It truly is a problem, because with Mitchell carrying on, and combine this with his firm belief that World War One had not been a war to end all wars. Again, as I've pointed out many times in our videos, not everyone did believe World War One meant war was over. He believed air power was the future, and that if you had air power, it would allow you to control the whole world more easily than a nation has controlled a continent in the past. That air power allows you to have permanent high ground. In simple terms, I'm not sure really. Do we compare him to a certain Jedi fighting a certain Sith, declaring the high ground is important to all victories, or do we declare him to the Sith who was fighting the Jedi who decided to try and vault over him and ended up getting cut in half? It's an interesting question, but truly, he keeps trying to push the air power is the future of everything. And he keeps trying to push the idea of a separate force from either the Army or the Navy. And this is where friction really starts to come about, because he managed to do something which no one else can do. I mean, no one. We're talking no one. You see, these four men, we have William Benson, the Chief of Naval Operations. We have the lovely Franklin D. Roosevelt, who's Assistant Secretary of Navy. We have Moffett, who's in charge of the Bureau of Aeronautics from 1921 when it stood up. And we have Sims, who'd been in charge of the Navy in European War, and whose public pronouncements basically meant that he didn't get charge of the Navy post-war. These four men, one who believes in the future of naval aviation as a vital asset, often wanders between both aircraft carriers and airships. One who is actually wargaming the future of the US Navy and is basically defining their concept of naval aviation, their concept of aircraft carriers, as we speak in this time period. He's pretty much using wargaming to define it. One who is basically using his post to trump all over another one who doesn't believe air power is more role than spotting, etc., and tries to get rid of a lot of the air power systems before he managed to successfully turn it into a Bureau of Aeronautics. These four cannot have different views on naval aviation. They cannot have different views on the value of naval aviation. They couldn't argue more if you tried. They often do. They all unite in fighting Mitchell. He brings them together. And I would argue furthermore, as I've said many times, that when people try and claim Mitchell as the father of aviation, and especially as, he was key to keeping US naval aviation going, no, he wasn't. He caused more trouble. He gave arguments and armor to this man to try and shut it down. But the thing is, this man wouldn't use them because he hated Mitchell more than he hated everyone else. And he just really, really disliked him. And basically, Mitchell managed to... He kept saying that naval aviation was obsolescent, that navies were obsolescent, that there was no point to having aircraft carriers, that whatever bomb was needed could be developed to sink a battleship. Please note, he keeps emphasizing bombing. This is the thing. Mitchell believes it's bombing. And eventually, Roosevelt even announces his ideas as being pernicious. In fact, though, Mitchell's going further, because he's saying that within 10 years, strategic air bombardment would become a threat to the United States and make the air service the nation's first line of defense instead of the Navy. Now, here is the small problem with that. Okay? For this, you have to have aircraft capable of carrying a significant bomb load in volume across either Atlantic or the Pacific. Or you have to presume the threat is coming from Canada or Mexico. Okay, maybe Russia to attack Alaska, but come on. That's still a long way. Or you have to be presuming that aircraft are going to get exponentially longer range and more capable than they already are in 10 years. Now, I know we have a lot of aircraft which cross the Atlantic today, but think about how many aircraft there are actually in service, in existence, which could cross the Atlantic or the Pacific. But let's go for the Atlantic. It's the slightly narrower one of the two. Drop a full bomb load and cross it to get back. Let's think how many aircraft there are. That can be today's first question. Go and find out how many aircraft there are which can actually do that today. And then go and look at the air forces and the aircraft in development in the 1920s and try and find an aircraft which can do it. And then look at the aircraft in the 1930s and try and find an aircraft that can do it. And then go to the 1940s and find an aircraft which can do it. You know, half the reason the US Navy and Army and all their forces engage in the island hopping campaign is to get air bases close enough to Japan they can bomb them. Why? Because their bombers can't cross the Pacific for bomb load and return. It's not because they fancy those islands, not because they want to take them. It's because they have to. So saying what he's saying in this period is obviously false. Now, you can go, well, no, he believes it to be true. You're making a statement, and you're making a statement publicly. The Navy's not useful, the aircraft carriers, and because of this is going to be the case. You're arguing your opinion is fact, and therefore this should be how the future is. But imagine if the US had actually gone down the route he's suggesting, if they got rid of all their battleships, if they didn't have aircraft carriers, if they got rid of the fleet. Imagine what happens in World War II. Because our other nation's going to do that. If America does it, our other nation's going to. Would Britain have got rid of its navy? No. Would Japan have got rid of its navy? No. Can we all see what problem would have happened? Yes, air power is great, and air power has potential. But these things take time to mature into the capabilities we know and love today. They really do. But all his fighting leads to, basically an agreement between the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, and the Secretary of Navy, Joseph Daniels. And this is especially after he finds out, well, Mitchell finds out that the actual Navy has already been doing exercises about sinking ships. And the data coming out isn't what he wants to hear. The data coming out is things to do with, yes, torpedoes are working, yes, there's bombing, they're damage, they're doing their own tests. Now, here's the small problem. He also tries to claim credit for the development of aerial torpedoes. No, he did not inspire their creation, as I've said before. They were already in use. There's an entire Sopwith Cuckoo. There are lots of other nations working on them. The Americans are also working on them. Bomb sites, well, he certainly advocated for them. Not really sure how much he really inspires them. He wanted sled runner landing gear for winter operations. That's not really so helpful, is it? And superchargers. Well, the fact is the horsepower race had started in about 1914 and was merrily going on. So you can advocate it all you like and claim you're advocating it, but the fact is it's already happening. There's lots of people doing it around the world. It's something they're competing of. It's turning into the air power equivalent of battleship gun sizes. Horsepower! It's what they all want. So, in February 1921, as I've written up here, these two gentlemen have an agreement. They have an agreement. Newton Baker is here. Joseph Daniels is above. And they are the Secretary of War and the Secretary of Navy, respectively. And they agree something known as Project B, which was to be an exercise of testing if you are bombing ships. And Project B is a pretty interesting scenario. It truly is. It's a pretty interesting capability. The idea was to test Mitchell's claims that he could sink ships under war conditions. That's what he wanted to. But the reality, the Navy agreed to it on the grounds that they would be allowed to pause the fighting, the bombing, a long way, so they could assess the damage done by bombs. So they could work out how to better design ships to withstand bomber damage, which was important to them, and how to better equip their personnel to do damage control and stabilization, which is what a crew would do. They were going to use surplus old ships. They were not going to have a crew aboard. So, again, they have no one doing damage control. They have no movement. They're just sitting there. And I'll point out again, air power has already sunk ships in World War I. Air power has already damaged ships in World War I. So, a lot of what you see in terms of the production of things is, well, how do I put this politely? Paper talk. Now, there were also supposed to be some blackouts over the test, so that data would not be released until it had been analysed. And the actual chief of the Air Corps tried to have Mitchell dismissed a week before the test began because he found him to not be responding properly to his requirements. And that, well, how do I put this politely? The Navy was getting upset with Mitchell keep going overboard with his criticisms. But John W. Weeks, who'd taken over as Secretary of War from Newton Baker, decided to back down because it became apparent that Mitchell was very good at getting widespread public and media support. You're starting to see another problem here. You now have a guy who's fairly sure he can't be taken down because he's seen as the messiah of the future, and he's got the support of the public. So, he has a questionable relationship with the truth. He's in charge of a major exercise, and he now feels he can't be got rid of. Life is going to start to unravel soon for Mitchell. But the rules of engagement are pretty interesting, because they basically come down to this. Ships had to be sunk in at least 100 fathoms of water so as not to become navigational hazards. That's fine. The area selected was 50 miles, 80 kilometers off the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. Sounds a perfectly reasonable range. That's quite simple. If you're trying to defend America, you should be able to reach out that far. The planes were not allowed to use aerial torpedoes because they already knew what aerial torpedoes could do. Only allowed to use their heaviest bombs twice on the battleship, and smaller ships could not be attacked with weapons larger than 600 pounds, so that they could actually see what was happening. And they would allow a damage control party to board between hits to go and look at the damage and assess it. Here's the problem, though. Now, Navy interpretation was this allowed for maximum chance for inspection and learning, simulating a real experience, and allowed them to understand what was going on the ships so they could better design future ships. That's useful. That is very useful. Unfortunately, air service, and for that let's actually basically say Mitchell's interpretation was this was too much in favour of the survivability of ships, and by not selecting either two areas closer to the base, they were putting an unfair disadvantage on aircraft in terms of their ability to operate over target area. Now, I love that, but I also would say this is a small problem here. If you're claiming you're going to be taking over the defence within 10 years, and considering the evolution of aircraft, you want to be the first line of defense for the US forces, a US state. What about their merchant ships? What about their ability to trade, even coastal trade? If you can't go that far off the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, because how many air bases are going to have to build? But also, the enemy will be able to sit not far away, come in, blast, and disappear if you can't operate that far out. If you want something closer, there's a lot of I find a lot of doublespeak amongst a lot of people at this point in the period trying to sell various things in defence, and it's not just the air power party. There's a few others where they're claiming that their systems are going to be able to do these amazing things in the future, but they want the test conditions to be under the most... to be set up in accordance with their limitations of their capabilities as they are right now. And when I say that, beneficial to the limitations of their capabilities as they are right now, because they can get out that far, they can fly that far, it's just not easy. They can fly that far, though. And that's the important thing. They can fly that far. And then we have the forces involved. And this is the first interesting point, is that these forces are realistically not that much not entirely American. SE-5 fighters, they're British. They are British. The Havilland fighters, again, they're British. The Havilland 4s. Douglas are American. Martin are American. Caproni are Italian. And Hadley Page are British. It shows the reality of the American Air Service at this point of the Army Air Service. In many ways, the US Navy is pushing far more into American construction and far less mixed. 125 aircraft, 1,000 men, all marshaled at Langley Field in Hampton, Virginia. So think about that. They were marshalled at Langley Field in Hampton, Virginia. And they had to bring together this much force to do this exercise. 125 aircraft. In contrast, their targets were mostly German cast-offs after the war, basically German reparations. And also, please note, the exercise was not just about aviation testing. On 21st of June, it was scheduled for U-117 to be bombed by aircraft. On 22nd of June, it was U-140, U-111, and UB-48 were to be attacked by Destroyer Division 36. On 26th of June, there was supposed to be a search and bombing of Iowa with dummy bombs. 13th of July, Destroyer G-102 was to be bombed by aircraft. On the 18th of July, Cruiser Frankfurt was to be bombed by aircraft. And it's the 20th of July, the battleship Ostfriesland is to be bombed by aircraft. Now, the questions being asked and put forward at this point by Mitchell were, a $30,000 airplane can sink a $40 million battleship, so why build a battleship? Oh, this was parroted off by Senator Borer. And words to that effect. You know, it's the constant thing of, can we get a cheaper defence? The point missed in all this is, A, you're going to need a lot of those aircraft to sink the battleship. Because you're going to need to have a lot of them around your country, and considering their range, they're not going to be able to project that far, and the enemy battleship can sit outside their range and choose its time for coming in, and it probably isn't going to come in alone. It's probably going to come in with another force around it. So you're not just sinking an individual ship, you're trying to sink a task group, which is going to be firing back at you and manoeuvring. Which these ships, by the way, weren't. Definitely not. And so they tried to introduce some ideas and some testings which would evaluate for that. But this is in no way wartime conditions. These are old ships. They are really old ships. They don't have any of the latest thinking in them, and they certainly don't incorporate any of the ideas the British now have for air defence and defence about aircraft, which they were planning on putting into their G-freeze and their N-freeze, and then they put into the N-freeze, and, well, also the F-free design, and the various other things they were working on. That just didn't happen. Now, I will say that one of the things I do find about these tests is that from both sides, you get some extremely heated, and I would say mildly biased positions. You know, there was one paper I read by, it's on the Navy's, the website, the history.navy.mil research thing, which is about the Navy bombing experiments. And the officer wrote that, you know, by 1942, the Royal Navy was a second-rate navy because of the fact the Fleet Air Arm had been part of the Royal Air Force. And I don't think anyone really seriously would be thinking that in 1942 or any point. And I would also argue that that same officer then goes on to suggest ideas like, every time after that, the Royal Navy adapted its Fleet Air Arm to be closer to the US model. And then you go, well, no it doesn't, because fundamentally the USN and the Royal Navy have very different ships and very different in terms of their idea, because of their geostrategic situation, very different concepts of operation. They have very similar outcomes and very similar aims in terms of what they'd like to achieve, but because of the geostrategic issues, they do operate very differently, and you look at things like squadron size, etc., and things are all very different, because they have to be, to deal with the differences that each one encounters. Doesn't make either one right or wrong. It just makes their situation different. But the trouble is, and I would say this, the moment you start discussing this scenario, this particular exercise, its results, and what happens afterwards, and how it's portrayed afterwards, you are dealing with a scenario where a lot of it becomes a very black and white, demarked, we are fighting over this. And you're either with us or against us. And the trouble is that then results in a lot of the people who are talking about afterwards and who are interpreting aviation afterwards adopting a similar policy of, it can't be, both sides can't be right, there has to be a right and a wrong, because they're already in that mindset. And I started off, and I did mention already, the whole idea of, well, you know, the battle aircraft's cheaper than the battleship, but how many battle aircraft do you need to cover? And versus the equation, the capability of the battleship. So, pretty much, Mitchell holds the Navy's restrictions. He successfully sinks the vessels he's allowed to sink in concert with Navy aircraft. Please note, there are Navy aircraft involved as well. Not just the Army. And on each ship, they're first attacked by SE-5 fighters, which are strafing and bombing to simulate suppression of the anti-aircraft fire, followed by attacks by Martin twin-engine bombers and occasionally other bombers to destroy things. And then Mitchell is watching this all from his de Havilland 4 observation aircraft, nicknamed the Osprey. And it's on the 20th of July that the USN brings out the Ostfriesland. Now, she is attacked by 230, 550 and 600 pound bombs by Navy, Marine Corps and Army aircraft, which, on the 20th of July, which had caused her to settle 3 feet by the stern with a 5-degree list to port. She's taking on water. Then, further bombings delayed that day. The Navy's reason was, due to rough seas, they prevented air border observers from going aboard. The Army Air Service counters, well, as our bombers were approaching, they were ordered not to attack. They had to circle for 47 minutes. As a result, they dropped only half their bombs and other large bombs. Well, honestly, that's probably due to the communications and the quality of communications at this time. I'm not surprised. There are many, how do I put this, logistical and infrastructure reasons to make the case for it that you would not necessarily presume malice or bad actors. On the 21st of July, well, 5 Martin MBS bombers were led by First Lieutenant Clayton Bissell, and they dropped a single 1,100 pound, that's 500 kilogram bomb each. And these scored 3 direct hits. Navy stops again the drops to assess damage. And Ostfriesland, by noon, had settled 2 more feet by stern and 1 foot by the bow. And remember, no one's doing damage control on this ship. It's not manoeuvring. It's not doing anything. It's sitting there. And then, later, Captain Walter R. Lawson's flight of bombers. These consisted of 2 Handley Page 0400s and 6 of the Martin MBS bombers, loaded with 2,000 pound bombs, were dispatched. One of the Handley Page dropped out for mechanical reasons, but the MBS ones dropped 6 bombs in quick succession. 6 bombs between 12:18 hours and 12:31 hours. They were aiming for the water near the ship, and this was something they'd been advised by a Russian officer who they'd managed to get in to advise them. They managed to find a very experienced Russian pilot called Alexander Savensky, who had bombed German ships during World War I, and he had put forward a suggestion that if you bombed near the ships, you could use the underwater concussive effect against the hull and cause them more damage. And it would stave in and separate hull plates. It's a very good idea. And it's very true. Now, here's the problem, though. If we remember these test results, they were allowed to use only allowed to use their heaviest bombs twice on the battleship. They just dropped 6. Mitchell, describing the attack, says 4 bombs hit in rapid succession, close alongside the Ostfriesland. She rose 8 to 10 feet between the terrific blows from water. On the 4th shot, Captain Stretz, sitting in the back seat of my plane, stood up and waved both arms, shouted, "She's gone." No direct hits. But they stoved in the hull plates and caused her to roll over. She sunk at 12:40 hours. 22 minutes after first bomb. And the Hadley Page then dropped a 7th bomb on the foam rising up from the sinking ship. This was all being observed by USS Henderson. And here's the point. And observers were sitting on board. Here's the point. This is all in violation of the rules agreed. So, he'd given his word as an officer. His senior officers had signed up to it. And yes, he might not agree with it. But he's violated that. But then he goes forward and says this is wartime conditions. What of this test was wartime conditions? Were they under AA fire? No. Was the ship manoeuvring? No. Was the damage control being done? No. Did they know exactly where the ship was when they took off and fly straight towards it because they'd done attacks on their day before on similar aircraft on other ships? Yes. Could they therefore line up their attack perfectly to hit at the perfect point? Yes. These are not wartime conditions. One interesting thing was that Navy studies of the wreck of the Australian, when they managed to get a look at her, showed she suffered little topside damage from bombs and was sunk by progressive flooding. They felt this might have been stemmed by fast-acting damage control party on board the vessel. But the trouble is, they couldn't prove that because they hadn't been able to get aboard to assess it. And he causes Pershing a lot of problems because he had tried to have the hope to smooth out the Army-Navy relations afterwards, but the thing is, the distrust had been sowed. And Mitchell's further acts afterwards would do more damage to this because Mitchell tried to put forward his own report. He tried to counter-report the joint report which had been put forward. The problem was, with all this floating around in the public media, it shaped the debate. It also ripped apart US Navy, US Army relations. And you can see a lot of the issues which develop into World War II between the services, especially when it comes to air service cooperation and air power cooperation, stem from this period. Fundamentally, a large section of the Navy do not trust the Army. They fundamentally do not trust them because of this. And also, there's a big argument here because, let's say they were able to get better information from this. That's going to then filter into more experiments, and the experiments which come afterwards, and then more experiments after this. And that's going to filter into the design choices they made, and that's going to filter into the ships being designed, and how the ships are being designed and shaped. We have no idea to work out how much better information about the effect of bombs and their damage on hulls, especially drop could affect ship design. One of the things that might have happened, and we can see this in the British approach to torpedo bulges. One of the reasons why the British like to flood them with water is the idea that would provide them some protection from concussive damage. And it does, because it spreads the load out a bit. It also provides them basically a de facto outer and inner hull. And that's useful. So, yeah, we have some interesting results lost here. But more importantly, we also have a very simplistic view, because we sunk it. Yes, we sunk it using bombs. Yes, therefore we can sink ships. Okay, but can you do it under wartime conditions? Because this is basically a lab experiment when you've got... That's like saying, yes, I can hit the target. I can hit the dartboard. When you hold when the board is there and I'm chucking from here, I can hit it perfectly every single time. I'm also fairly good at slightly longer range, but I'm definitely not as good as I am when I'm this far away. I think we can all agree when we're that far away, when we can do that, we can hit the target. The trouble is it's imagery, and the US Navy is not that good at fighting imagery at this point, and they can't give their own imagery. But I would argue that if the US Navy had just wanted to show whether they could be sunk or not, they'd have just sent in a flight of torpedo bombers. Because they could have sunk it. Very quickly. But everyone knows you let in water, you sink a ship. Whether it's concussion with bombs to cause the hull plates to buckle, or it's torpedoes. If you're letting in water, you sink a ship. Now, this didn't stop there being further tests. These tests were all about different types of bombs. What bombs could be used? What bombs will be best? Were bombs really effective? But again, they're on pre-dreadnoughts. They're on the oldest ships available. And that's a constant theme. This is always on the oldest ships available. And by September 19... Wow. September 1921, Menower forces a showdown over Mitchell. He finds him frankly annoying. And Menower asks the Secretary Weeks and demanded that he either relieve Mitchell as Assistant Chief of the Air Corps, or he would resign himself. Weeks allowed Menower to resign, but did not allow Mitchell to resign. However, Mason Patrick is then chosen. Major General Mason Patrick is chosen by Pershing to sort out the mess. And this continues to problems, because Mitchell believed he's next. He should be in charge, but no, he's not. Because he's becoming too much of a political hot potato. Because of what he's doing. And Patrick is a even stronger character than Menower, and basically tells Mitchell that he'll expect his expertise as counsel, but the decisions are going to be made by him and him alone, and if Mitchell tries to go off the reservation on that, there will be problems. At this point, Mitchell managed to get into an issue. At the start of the Naval Arms Limitation Conference, Mitchell tries to supplant Moffett, who's the US Navy's head, as the senior aviation person, tries to push him around. Moffett is a rear admiral. He's a rear admiral. He's not a short-term appointment, a temporary appointment, or a recess appointment as a brigadier general. He is a rear admiral. Rear admirals are senior to brigadiers anyway. But that causes an issue. It's also a US Naval, it's also a Naval Arms Limitation Conference, and the Navy's there in strength. It causes upset. It causes problems. It causes Mitchell to get sent away. He's sent to do an inspection tour of Europe. And that would last the duration of the conference. And then he has another issue. He's sent to West Virginia to try and stop what was basically warfare that had broken out. He describes that Army bombers alone would end the Mingo War, as he calls it, between pretty much miners and the coal company. It doesn't, and furthermore, rather than Air Force bombers or Air Service bombers dropping tear gas on miners, what actually happened was company-hired aircraft dropped dynamite bombs on the miners. Honestly, Mitchell's aircraft, the most they did was crash, which killed 3 crewmen. It's not good. Eventually, though, they had to send in 2,000 army troops to disperse Sheriff Don Chaffin's 3,000 personnel hired, and miners mostly went home, although some surrendered to the army. Mitchell cited the Mingo War as an example of the potential for air power in civil services. I myself would cite it as an example of, oh good God, don't do this again, please. But that's just me. Eventually, his issues led him to being in the court-martial. He really got into the theories of Giulio Douhet after his 1922 trip that he was sent on to avoid him being part of the Naval Arms Limitation Conference. And, well, he was in love with that. And then, 24, Patrick dispatches him again on an inspection tour of Hawaii and Asia to try and get him again off the first front pages. Mitchell came back with a colossal report that predicted not only the future of a war with Japan, and including an attack on Pearl Harbor, but he decided it would not be aircraft carriers, it would be, they were of little practical use. He believed that they would be land-based aircraft operating from the islands in the Pacific, attacking Pearl Harbor. He published this report as the book Winged Defense. And, well, how do I put this politely? It sold 4,500 copies, which is pretty good. But let's be honest, with the months sold only 4,000 copies, but then there's the court-martial. The trouble is, what's the court-martial caused by? Well, Mitchell does his usual perspective thing, but he takes it a bit too far. He takes it a bit too far. In September 1925, he'd issued a statement accusing that the loss of the Shenandoah and the loss of seaplanes were incompetent and treasonable administration of national defense. And unsurprisingly, in October 1925, this is after his lovely book has been out for a while, a charge with 8 specifications was preferred against Mitchell on direct order of President Calvin Coolidge, accusing him of violating the 96th Article of War. They tried to say this was unconstitutional as a violation of free speech. But the trouble is, free speech can cover things as long as what you're saying is true. Because his assertions about non-aviation officers being ignorant of aviation matters were shown to be false, because he claimed events he'd witnessed on Hawaii that happened during some experiments led by Leslie J. McNair that didn't exist. This is an issue. In fact, he managed to sufficiently annoy so many that there was a list of officers to come in and talk about what he'd said was wrong. It wasn't happened. They were able to show that his claims that during his time in Hawaii, that the Hawaiian Department had no plan to defend Oahu from a Japanese attack, was false. He was also shown that this, rather than his claims of the Air Service not being treated fairly in distributed resources, that Summerhall, the commander of the Hawaiian Department, actually had reallocated funding, equipment, and other items from other branches to the Air Service. And that's the problem. So, is he right that air power coming is going to be important? Yes. Is he right that about the methods of attack? No. But that doesn't really matter. No one's going to be able to predict the future accurately. Again, it's the methodology which is the problem. And this is the issue with him. And this is the issue with reversing his charges and saying he was a political, he fell for political reasons. No. He was making statements and attacking everyone based on lies. And that's the problem. So, saying that all, I now have to do a legacy question. I have to do a question on him for this channel. And that's interesting because, having read some recent comments on the video which went up on the 24th of May, before re-recording some sections of this, then re-recording all of it, I'm worried some people are reading more into questions than I actually put in them, because I don't know about you, but my view is, and has always been, that questions should not be hidden questions. They should not have hidden meanings. When I give these questions, they're like I give coursework. There's nothing hidden. What's in the words is the words. That's it. Might they lead to slightly more thinking than necessarily they lead to on the surface? Potentially. But someone who literally wrote in a comment that, what was it? Where's it again? Find it. I think what it really means is, how come we smart academics keep telling you how great Italy's World War II performance was, and you dummies don't listen? Okay, for starters, as I've said many times before, getting a PhD is not about brain power, it's about stubbornness. I will say this over and over again. There are plenty of smart people who don't get a PhD, even when they start one, let alone the number of people who don't want one in the first place. I only did one because, as I've said before, I'm dyslexic. It's great fun to be able to go back to your old school when you're a dyslexic, when they told you you wouldn't even get a degree, and you've got a PhD. That makes it all worth it, okay? That's entirely the reason. Also, it's some quite good skills for being a historian. I'm going to do a scuttlebutt. There's another one coming up, and I'm going to be answering that comment fully, but the point I'm using it here is, I want to quickly address this now. When I ask a question, I'm asking a question. And that's it. That's what I'm doing. I'm just asking that question. So, yeah, I'm sorry if you interpret it as me looking down on you in some way, but no. I'm even more surprised when that comes from someone who's subscribed to me. Just, if you think I'm treating you as if you're stupid, then why would you subscribe to my channel? It just seems confusing. But leaving that all to one side, the reason I'm adding this point in is I definitely don't want that ever to be the view. So I'm dealing with this video, and I'm going to deal with it in a scuttlebutt. I'm presuming they're not putting in because they're being rude to me. I'm presuming it's because they think they're not just being rude for the sake of being rude, or something like that. But no, with Billy Mitchell, the question I'm going to ask is whether you think his legacy, or the legacy of this testing and his reaction to this testing, were more divisive in terms of setting up so that the US Army Air Corps and the US Navy do not cooperate as much as they should do, and they have a legacy of actually not working together and exercises and dispute relations because of this, because they no longer trust each other. And it takes years to rebuild that trust, and the work of men such as King and Marshall, huge amounts of effort to rebuild that, and Leahy especially. Or is it more defect in the US Army Air Corps' preoccupation with the idea of bombing ships, especially using level bombing and large bombers to do a large bombing effort against ships, and the reality was that doesn't work so well. I'll be interested to hear your views. Anyway, that much said, let's see what we've got coming up next week. Next week we have the conception, operation, conclusion of the Chicago class, and the live is yet to be announced because I've still got 3 options and I'm not sure which one I'm going to pick, but there is going to be announced soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. If you like the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. That really does help the channel grow. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you don't think like that commentator did, because that's not my intention at all. I always find it strange, some people with academics, but I do agree there are some academics who do literally focus on talking to the academic world and ignore everyone else. I do agree to that, but I've always disagreed with that as a methodology. My view is the vast majority of people will not get a PhD. They wouldn't want one. They wouldn't need one. And the vast majority of people don't need those sorts of qualifications for doing what they want to do. But there are a lot of people who are interested in history. And the thing is, a lot of people who are interested in history are very interested and very good in history. And you can learn from everyone. The whole point about history is passing on lessons, is passing on understanding. And if you try and limit A, the people who are passing it on, and B, the people who you listen to when they are giving their views, by any means, you're restricting your own ability to learn, and that is silly. And that's truly silly, because my view is that it's the moment you stop learning is when you should stop teaching. And I view all my work in naval history, all this stuff, as part of my teaching, because it's part of spreading the love of naval history. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you fancy supporting the channel, please consider becoming a patron or a member, or doing Ko-fi or super chats or super thanks, because they really do help me buy the books, which help me expand what I can talk about, because the more books I have, the more I can talk about. The more I can go and do research, that's even better. But at the moment, moving house, so it's books, not going to visit the sites for research. Thank you very much, and take care.